cynical that it took them 2 years, a committee of 23 eminent people. And here's the definition they came up with. Primary, very important. If you go in, see a doctor, and they have depression or alcoholism, the doctor might say, oh well, let me give you some pills for the depression, and then that'll cure the alcoholism. Wrong. It's a primary illness. You cure, stop the drinking first, and then see what else emerges, because of all the 80 plus illnesses related to alcohol dependence, giving up alcohol is the first thing. It's the primary thing. Chronic disease, chronic from the word chronos, time, long-lasting, over a period of 12 months. Now, I've just highlighted the three, progressive and fatal. People don't understand what progressive actually means. It means this, and it's very important. A person who gives up alcohol for 20 years, a bit like your drug addict who's in prison and then comes out and uses heroin. After 20 years, if they have a drink, it's not as though they're back. They stop drinking, let's say, at age 30, and they have a drink when they're age 50. It's not as though they're back to age 30. The actual illness, the disease in this term, you can use the disease, has been building up within them. So it's as though they've been drinking for 20 years. Very difficult to get your head around that concept, and even more difficult for alcoholics to get their head around that concept. But somehow within the body, it is well adjusted to the craving as though they've been drinking all those 20 years. Very difficult to understand. Talk to an alcoholic who has stopped drinking for 10 years and ask them, was it worse? And they'll say, oh, 10 times worse. And they're not used to drinking that amount or feeling that way in the morning, but that's how insidious the illness actually is. What I like to talk about is the 3 C's, that it's a chronic disease, long-lasting. Control over drinking, that's the big one. Ask a person, do you have control over your drinking, or does the drinking have control over you? That's the simple question. Do you have control over your drinking? How often can you go into a pub? Say I'm going in for 2 pints and leave. How often can you do that? Or do you find you're in the pub until closing time and you drank 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 pints? There's sort of a early stage alcoholic, middle stage alcoholic, chronic alcoholic. Early stage, 50% of the time, they can go into a pub and leave after 2 pints, but they don't know which 50%. They don't know which one. The middle stage alcoholic, 3/4 of the time, they can go into a pub and they're going to have to stay there. Chronic alcoholic, 99% of the time, they go into the pub, they're going to stay there unless the police are coming in to arrest them. Otherwise, they're going to stay there. So if you can remember the 3 C's, chronic disease, control, consequences. And as I said, distortions in thinking, most notably denial. If you're a clinician, or even if you have someone who has a problem with alcoholism and you want to ask them indirectly, there's what's called the cage. And the cage is a short 4 questions. C, do you have difficulty controlling your drinking? And then A, second part of cage is, anybody ever get angry with you because of your drinking? Then there's G, anybody, do you ever feel guilty about your drinking? And then there's E, what's called the eye opener. But in fact, not many alcoholics that I meet or see will actually always have what's called an eye opener, a drink in the morning. Much more likely, I'd much prefer if the cage had a B in it, which would be blackouts. Do you ever have blackouts? If someone drinks and they have blackouts, believe me, that is a serious indicator of alcoholism, because it's like the brain has been assaulted by alcohol and it has to switch off. It's a terrific indicator. So the cage report, the cage is a great indicator of whether a person has an alcohol problem. It's called a cage questionnaire. Now, while in the DSM and in the World Health Organization report and even the Committee on Addiction, They mention psychosocial, biological causes of alcoholism, but there's been no mention of a spiritual aspect. And as Jungians, we might look at the spiritual aspect of some medical problems. Very different than the religious aspect. So the DSM, it has, believe it or not, it's got a little piece in there, I think page 725 of DSM-5. I'm right, 725, yeah. Religious or spiritual problem only made it into a subsection of the DSM-4 and 5 under the category of other conditions that may be the focus of clinical attention. We have this massive big group, psychological problems, and we as Jungians are saying, and Carl Jung said that many psychological problems are as a result of dis-ease, ill at ease with our centered selves, indicating that behind many psychological problems there may be a spiritual context of not being at ease with our spirit or our true self. So they give it, I think, 4 lines in this massive big DSM-5, the Bible of psychiatrists and psychologists. Now, Carl Jung and Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, they agree on the definition of alcoholism. So here are 2 men. One knows a tremendous amount of detailed information from working with alcoholics, namely Bill Wilson. And Carl Jung still continues to amaze me that he seemed to know about everything. It's like, awesome. I remember when I was teaching and training as a teacher, I was interested in gifted children, and lo and behold, who would I go to read about? Carl Jung. And it was one of my introductions to Carl Jung as to how could he know about this subject and know so much about it. The saying, show me a drunk and I'll show you someone in search of God, is popularly attributed to Carl Jung. I actually don't believe he ever said that. Not in those words. But some people, particularly in Alcoholics Anonymous, will quote that and they'll say it's from Carl Jung. And I've searched. It isn't there. But what I think it is, it filtered down from what Carl Jung actually did say in a much more elaborate way. He said, alcoholism is the equivalent on a low level of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness, expressed in medieval language, the union with God. And when I ask people with alcohol problems or an addiction, how would you describe it? Sometimes they say, well, it's like having a hole in the heart, something missing. And that the alcohol or the drug fulfills it, fills me up. And here we are, the wholeness is missing. But it's a search to reunite with that wholeness. Bill Wilson said, only a spiritual experience will conquer alcoholism. Only a spiritual experience. He also said no human power, which means all the psychiatrists and all of the people who are concerned about the alcoholic will not succeed. No human power will cure them. And that's very hard to imagine. And I've asked several doctors, in particular one answered me, well, you know, I conducted my own survey of 12 doctors when I was at a meeting, and I asked them, have you ever cured an alcoholic? Not one of them said no, yes. No. They all just said, no, of course not, we can't. They don't say that because I don't know, the training is that they can cure everything. But the fact is that doctors are fairly well-meaning but helpless when it comes to treating alcoholism and I would say drug addiction. So Jung's diagnosis that alcoholism is primarily a low-level search for spirituality is, and the hypothesis is that this low-level search for spirituality has been misdirected into addiction, and that addiction is a disguised spiritual illness. I come across spiritus contra spiritum. One spirit contradicts the other spirit. I'll talk about this in a moment, as Carl Jung said. But that's the hypothesis, that alcoholism is indeed a low-level search for spirituality, and that's why alcohol is called a spirit, as Carl Jung noted. So Jung's influence and relationship to AA from 1926, most people think he first contacted Roland Hazard in 1931. It's recently been shown it was actually as far back as 1926. Roland Hazard was an American alcoholic who was going to visit Europe, and it was suggested he would go and see Freud, but Freud wasn't available, so instead he went to Carl Jung. And Carl Jung told him, only thing that can relieve his illness, his malady, is spiritual connection. And Carl Jung got that from a Roman emperor called Marcus Aurelius, who had written it 2,000 years before and advised his troops who had alcohol problems that they must get a religious connection to overcome their problem with alcohol. That was Marcus Aurelius, a much undiscovered almost philosopher. So we always associate, I do anyway, Roman emperors with excess, but his works are actually very revealing. So he said the same thing as Carl Jung, although we credit Carl Jung with it, spiritus contra spiritum. One spirit contradicts the other spirit. So the spirit of alcohol contradicts the true spirit within. So Bill Wilson wrote a letter to Jung in 1961. And he said, I doubt if you're aware of a certain conversation you once had with one of your patients, Roland H., Mr. Roland H., back in the early 30s. It played a critical role in the founding of our fellowship. So he actually says the 30s. As I said, he was mid-20s. So I'll just see if I have it here, what actually happened. Wilson was referring to the advice Jung had given to the alcoholic Roland Hazard in 1926 about the need for a vital spiritual experience to help with his alcohol problem, spiritus contra spiritum. Now, Roland H. was in treatment with Jung. Jung told him, get a connection with a religion. He wasn't concerned which one, but he wanted it to be more spiritual than ritual. That's very important. Wasn't too happy with the ritual of religion. And in fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think he ever visited the church in Kushnok where he lived for 40 years until his wife died, and then he visited. That was the only time in 40 years. So, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but as far as I know. So, he was very spiritual, but very separate from religion. Now, why Bill Wilson wrote to him was because that man, Roland Hazard, came back to New York and joined the Oxford movement, which were a group, a religious group who had 4 principles, particularly honesty and confession. And he went to a judge who was about to sentence somebody called Ebby Thatcher to a lunatic asylum. Because Ebby Thatcher was a fall-down drunk and also a friend of Bill Wilson. And what he did was, while he was on holiday in Vermont, he got into his car in a drunken state and drove it into the side of a house and went right into that side of the house. Of course, like many alcoholics, he got out unscathed, but the car was actually in the kitchen of the house. Now, according to Ebby, he got out and he said to the woman of the house who was cowering in the corner, "Don't suppose there's any chance of a cup of coffee." These are alcoholic tales. They're bravado. I mean, contrast that with our friend, the poet Dylan Thomas, who in Greenwich Village said, I've had straight 18 whiskeys straight. Young man at 38. His doctor then gave him some sedatives because he complained about something. either he had an illness or something. He died that night. They're the ones who don't survive. But anyway, every story about, don't suppose a chance of coffee, but the next day he's in front of a judge who's all prepared to send him to an asylum for the mentally ill. That's the reality of it. Then there's the jokey side. But the reality is a mental asylum for him. Now, Roland Hazard, with a friend of his, went to see the judge, who happened to be the father of one of their other friends. They were socialites and well off. They persuaded the judge to allow Evan Thatcher to join the Oxford movement, which he did. 2 months later, he went to Bill Wilson and persuaded Bill Wilson to join the Oxford group. And that's the connection with Roland Hazard. That's what's called the lineage. And Bill Wilson wrote, so delighted he was that Roland Hazard went to see Jung instead of Freud, because he said he'd much prefer to have a lineage with Jung than Freud, who he considered was too materialistic and didn't have the spiritual awareness. So here we have it here. Roland Hazard rescued his friend Ebbie Thatcher and committed to an asylum. Ebbie in turn inspired Bill Wilson to try and stop drinking, join the Oxford group, so he became Bill's sponsor. So Wilson considered he had a lineage to Jung. Here's the extract from the letter, and the reason I left it on at the beginning was because it's so detailed. But if you can imagine, he's writing this in 1961, he's saying, I had to be very careful when I talked to Roland Page. We wonder, why did he have to be careful? Because he recognized that his alcoholism was the equivalent on a low level of the spiritual thirst, the union with God expressed in medieval language. But he said, how could one formulate such an insight in a language that is not misunderstood in our day? Because he was frightened of the psychoanalytic profession, the psychiatric profession, criticizing him. And at this time, I think he had been expelled a few times from a few organizations, as you know, so he's already feeling like an outsider. So he's worried if he's starting to tell his patients about a religion, that he'd be even more criticized. But it's very sad to think that such a great man, having the answer to this problem, felt he couldn't divulge it. Now bear in mind, this was in the mid-20s, early 30s.